Folks, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. And I wish I could be with you physically, but obviously that's not possible. But seeing you on Zoom is at least some kind of compensation. Back in 1970, an author called Alvin Toffler wrote a book called Future Shock. I don't know if any of you ever read that book. But what Toffler was trying to do was to illustrate how far humanity as a whole has come since early history or prehistory. And in particular, how quickly culture seems to move on. And he used the expression, which I thought was a very good expression, accelerated culture, to describe the kind of world that we are now living in, particularly in the Western world. Now, 1970, that was an absolutely landmark book. But anyone reading Future Shock today would just laugh because it feels so dated. We are now living in a much more accelerated culture where things change at such a hugely rapid rate. It can be almost disorientating just to watch the news, for example. And for us as Christians, it's a real challenge, because while the gospel doesn't change, and I want to emphasize that, the gospel has always been good news. It always will be good news. Nevertheless, the world into which we're speaking is changing all the time. And we need to get a sense of what kind of changes are taking place. All the way back in 1 Chronicles 12, we read about the men of Issachar who understood the times. And I think there's a real need for Christians today to understand the times as we try to reach out. Now, what kind of culture changes are we experiencing in our world? Well, I want to narrow it down to a very small number, because otherwise I could be here for hours and hours talking about how our culture is developing. And obviously I'll just focus on Western culture because it's very different here from other parts of the world. But it seems to me that in very, very recent years, the last 5 years, there have been half a dozen massive cultural changes that have impacted us, that the church, I think, needs to very quickly pick up on, so that as we bring the unchanging gospel to our community, we can do so in a way that's still relevant. So let me go through those 6 issues first of all, and then we'll think about some ways in which we can relate to them. I think the first change that I'm really struck by is all the questions that do relate to our colonial past. You'll have seen in the news not all that long ago, those scenes in Bristol. Is actually during, I think, the first lockdown, where mobs gathered around the statue of Colson and they ripped it off its plinth and threw it into the river. And just much more recently, in the last week, at Magdalen College in Oxford, the students voted to have the picture of the Queen taken down off the common room walls and put away somewhere because of the Queen's link with colonialism. Now, you might be thinking already, what on earth do those things have to do with a Christian conference like this? But dare I say, and forgive my bluntness, one of the reasons why you might be thinking those questions is because when I look at all the screens here, most folk on screen are white. Most folk are of a certain age, and my gray hair represents that same kind of age band. And most of us probably come from a fairly middle-class background. But if you were to talk to some of the ethnic minorities in the UK today, or to young folk in general, members of the BAME community, that sense of being British, which I feel very keenly and very strongly as part of my heritage, it's something that sits very uncomfortably with them. And that does relate to church life in this regard. Often in people's mind, the church is linked to the establishment, and therefore we are lumped together with that old worldview that people perceive there to be, and it's not where they're at. And then those questions of colonialism, and by the way, academics call it post-colonial theory. It's also linked with the whole issue of racism. Now, lots of folk in our culture see racism in places where racism isn't. I do not think that racism is endemic in the UK today. However, I would say that the anger that we are experiencing in culture just now is very real, because there are traits of racism throughout much of British culture. I noticed yesterday in the news it was announced that in the Euros, the Scottish team would also take the knee along with the English team during the Euros, because they want to support the whole cultural tsunami, which is the Black Lives Matter movement, which lots of young folk are embracing and getting very excited by. Now, while racism is not as bad as people think it is in the UK, a couple of things we can't deny. First of all, generally speaking, if you come from an ethnic minority, particularly if you come from a Black or a Pakistani community, your prospects are more limited than if you come from the kind of community that I grew up in. And if you look at the most deprived communities within the UK, it's also true that they are disproportionately populated by people from ethnic minorities. That's an issue that we do need to recognize. And by contrast, if you look at the leadership of Christian organizations and Christian churches, they are underrepresented by ethnic minorities. I find that quite sobering, actually. I'm, as Glyn already said, the general director of GLOW, and I work very closely with a number of Christian organizations, Echoes International Counties, Church Growth Trust. And on all of our boards, we have nobody from an ethnic community. Now, I find that challenging, given the kind of young folk that I mix with and talk to in everyday evangelism. Now, am I saying that the church is tainted by racism? No, I'm not. The church, I do not believe, is tainted by racism. Quite the opposite. And yet perception is massive. It is really massive. And as our culture looks in at the church, it sees amongst the leadership predominantly white, predominantly middle class, and that leaves a message which we need to be aware of, because people are looking at us and viewing us. And then there's the whole issue of, dare I say it, sexism, which has become and continues to be a massive issue, particularly again amongst our younger generation. The 19th and 20th centuries saw massive cultural battles taking place, and feminism coming to the fore, and feminists fighting for their corner, with an agenda that I have to confess I struggle with, because of the way in which many feminist thinkers and academics negated the differences between male and female, which is not where I am at. I don't think those differences are unreal. I think that they exist. And so I disagree with feminist theory. And yet the church has been viewed often as a kind of a bastion of those attitudes of sexism. And more recently, the whole picture has been muddied by the trans issue, because feminists have come to the fore once again, trying to defend women's rights in view of the whole trans debate. You have academics like Germaine Greer, who's a very well-known feminist writer, and she has been deplatformed and criticized. Why? Because she does not believe that a trans woman is a real woman. Now, she's doing so on the basis of science, but for that reason, she has been castigated. And I follow the work of lots of feminist thinkers who are now saying womanhood is once again under threat because of the trans issue. And actually, I agree with much of what they say. Now, here's the thing. The gospel is good news on all of those questions, whether it's colonialism or racism or sexism. We have the good news from Genesis 1:26 that we are all made in God's image. So the oldest message the world has ever heard on equality comes from the Word of God. Before slavery itself ever existed, God was declaring that we're all made in his image. So the gospel is good news. The problem is that we're not being heard properly. And we're often being associated with some of those questions and some of those problems, when in actual fact, we do have a message of equality, which we have always been proclaiming to the world. So that's something to think about. And then fourthly, there's the whole issue of sexuality. That's a major issue. You'll all know that a few years ago, when we had those cultural debates over same-sex marriage, this whole debate raised its head, and there's a landmark victory. It was actually on the 17th of July back in 2013, where in the UK we allowed for the legalization of same-sex marriage. But have you noticed that culture hasn't stopped there? It hasn't stopped. In fact, it's kept going on. And now we need to not only accept same-sex marriage and same-sex relationships, we need to celebrate it. There's massive pressure to celebrate and to join the pride marches and to put out your rainbow flag. And you'll notice a number of government departments and businesses that have been pressurized into signing up to Stonewall's diversity program, including, by the way, the Welsh government. I looked at the most recent set of accounts for Stonewall, and in their most recent accounts, the Welsh government gave £157,000 to Stonewall's charitable activities. And it made me ask the question, I wonder how many churches or Christian organizations the Welsh government gave that amount of money to. But Stonewall have begun to take it for granted. Now, the church is also being painted in this discussion because we are being viewed by our broader culture as being homophobic. Now, you and I know it's not as simple as that, because we do have a biblical story that we stand by. But here's the problem. Because the Judeo-Christian worldview has been so lost in our society, and because our society has ceased to think about issues of sexuality in a balanced way, when our broader culture talk about issues like morality and justice and fairness, they are seeing it in a very different way from the way we as Christians see that same discussion. And we are perceived as being unfair, as being unjust, as being morally in the wrong because of the stance that we take on Judeo-Christian worldview issues. And we've got a genuine problem, a genuine issue. And the view that the average, certainly here in Scotland, the average person takes of the church and of Christians when it comes to the issue of sexuality is that we're in that camp of the homophobic, and we've got a big battle to deal with here. And then fifthly, you have the very, very recent issue of gender confusion, which has literally exploded on the scene in the last 5 or 6 years, with the BBC actually taking a lead on this. You know, the BBC in their educational programs claim that there are around 100 different genders. Now, that's a major issue, which does percolate around to everyday culture. I was visiting a friend of mine recently, actually just yesterday. I was visiting because he'd just been through surgery. And as I began to ask him about spiritual issues and talk to him about how he was he told me that his 13-year-old daughter came in from school just a few days ago to announce to her parents that she was pangender. Now, that has to come from somewhere. And he's got a whole issue to now deal with his own children. Now, we, of course, as Christians, are rightly concerned about what's taking place, because we do care about culture. I am very worried as a Christian who's concerned about our world and concerned about society. I'm very concerned about the kind of stuff that goes on in the Tavistock Centre, for example, where, in my opinion, and I'm only expressing a personal opinion here, what has taken place there has been tantamount to child abuse. I'm deeply concerned about charities like Mermaids, who get funding from the Department of Education to go into schools and to encourage primary school children to think about transitioning. Those are major issues, but that's the kind of culture we live in. And as Christians, when we speak about these issues in the public square, Not only are we denounced as being homophobic, we're also denounced as being transphobic, which of course is frankly one of the cultural lies that are being told. We are not transphobic. We do not disparage these people. We love them because Jesus said, love your neighbor and bless those who persecute you. Love those who hate you. And we do so. That is the Christian position. We love people, but we also have a genuine concern about the profound cultural problems that are taking place in our society. And we need to speak out, but when we do so, we have to do so carefully, because the way in which our culture has moved so quickly. And then sixthly, and maybe worst of all, there is the whole issue of political correctness. And here's the challenge that we face. When we stand up and speak about such issues in the public square, we are very quickly dismissed as being intolerant, because our culture has so imbibed the pill that is political correctness that any departing from the given cultural norms that are now endemic, you're seen to be speaking out of turn, to being impolite, to being intolerant. And we shouldn't speak about such things. You'll have heard the expression woke culture. If you don't know what woke culture is, Google it, look it up, because that's the cultural mood music that's currently taking place. And woke culture has its high priests and high priestesses, and it's all those wounded celebrities that are damaged and want to speak out. People like, for example, Harry and Meghan. Now there's an irony if ever there was. They escaped the royal family because they don't want to have the TV cameras on them. And what do? They sign up to hugely expensive and profitable TV contracts so that the TV cameras are still surrounding them, and they can express their hurt, their past, and all their underprivilege. It actually makes you smile, doesn't it? And yet they're listened to. They have huge popularity, particularly amongst the younger generation. And as they unpack all their hurt, we are in the firing line. And when we stand up and say, well, hang on a second, let's think about this, all of a sudden we're told, well, you're being impolite. You're hurting me by what you say. I need a safe space here. So don't speak to me like that, because you're damaging me by your prejudiced views. You see how warped it all is. Notice all the name calling, which is part of our contemporary culture, and it's a challenge for us as the church. Now, somebody might ask me, are you discouraged by all of this? Honestly, no, I'm not. And for two reasons. First of all, God is great. And I know our culture is confused, but God is great. And we need as Christians to have a sense of confidence. And secondly, I'm not discouraged, because this is also the kind of world the early church emerged from and grew. Because the early church burst on the scene in a world of confusion, in a world of prejudice and racism and name calling, in a world where there was no Judeo-Christian worldview, and where the church had from the very beginning a very bad press. And they loved their neighbor and they won out. But they also learned to speak wisely in culture. And I'm reminded with this, I finish, I'm reminded of a very helpful passage for me in Acts 17, which I won't read to you, but it's from verses 16 to the end of the chapter, where Paul goes to speak in the city of Athens. And I find this passage so relevant for the church's witness in our contemporary culture. Because in verse 16, he notices that the city was full of its idolatry. Now, that was a remarkable comment to make, because Athens, of course, was the intellectual center of the world. It was the zenith of world culture. And Paul saw the brokenness, the utter brokenness of that culture, and it moved him to do something about it. And we as Christians need to not turn a blind eye to our culture, not continue to live in our bubble, but to engage with it and bring good news to a broken culture, which is what Paul does in verse 17. He begins, as was his normal practice, to preach in the synagogues, but notice he doesn't stay there. He leaves the synagogue and he goes out to the marketplace, verse 17, and that's where he does his activity. And dare I say, given the way in which church attendance has fallen off a cliff, and nowhere in the UK is church attendance at a worse level than it is in Wales. I pray for Wales, because Wales is in a very challenging situation. And you know that. Look at the valleys where my family come from, the center of the Welsh revival. I don't know how many churches in the Welsh valleys are into double figures. It's a real spiritual mission field to reach out to the 800,000 people who still live there. That's a challenge for the gospel. That's a missionary challenge. Paul goes out to the marketplace because people don't go to church in a place like Athens. And neither do they go to church in a place like the Welsh valleys. So we've got to go out to them. And then as we work down the passage, he comments when he's invited to the Areopagus, which, by the way, was the very center of that pagan culture in Athens. That was well beyond Paul's comfort zone. But that's where he went. To the equivalent of, for example, that common room in Magdalen College in Oxford, where the Queen's picture has been removed. That's the marketplace. Or the local communist society meeting here in Motherwell. That's where I want to go and share the good news. Or just to my neighbor, to have a cup of coffee with him. He's an ex-Buddhist. He's half Chinese, half Scottish, who's never been to church in his life. And the only religious fiber in his bones is the Buddhism that he learned from his father, who was a drunk and has now passed away. And sitting in his living room talking about my own faith. That's the marketplace. And Paul says to the Athenians, I see that you're very religious. Now, he's not complimenting them on their religious belief. What he's saying is, folks, there are things that are important to you, and I want to speak about those things. Yes, there are things that are important to our culture. Racism, prejudice, sexism. All of those things are hot button issues. And the question is, what are we saying about those things as the church? We've got lots to say because we have a message of liberation. The gospel is good news. People just need to hear that good news. And we need to learn how to speak to them about good news. And then in verse 23, he talks about the altar to the unknown God. The Athenians were pantheists. They believed in lots of gods. And just in case they missed one out and offended that god by mistake, they had altars that were built. This was only one of them. There were several in the city of Athens. They had altars built to unknown gods, just so they made sure they covered all their bases. That's the bankruptcy of pantheism. Our culture is utterly bankrupt. And we need to learn to point out to people in our culture the precipice that our culture is staring into. Right now, because of all these forces that I've talked about, our culture has been torn apart. And despite all of our wealth, all of our privilege, there has never been a generation that is so well off, that's had such access to education, that's been so well fed than this current generation. And yet it's unhappy, it's paranoid, and rates of depression and suicide amongst young people has never been higher. Our culture has failed, utterly failed. And I mean, to learn to point that out. And then Paul begins to preach to them about the good news, but notice he doesn't begin with Jesus. He begins with creation and the existence, the objective existence of God, who makes all men and to whom we're all accountable. And only at the very end of his sermon does he talk about Jesus. Why? These people don't have a Judeo-Christian worldview. They know nothing about the God of the Bible. And can I say, for most people in our culture, when we say to them things like, there is power in the cross of Jesus Christ, they have no idea what we're talking about. No idea whatsoever. Jesus can save you. Well, from what? I don't need saved. I've got the NHS. That's my new religion. Boris is always there, Boris Johnson in the background, to make sure that my gyro is paid. What do you mean Jesus saves? That's an utterly meaningless statement in our culture. We've got to begin to build a biblical worldview with people and share with them what the good news is. It's good news because our culture is so bankrupt. There is no solution to the hurts of our culture apart from the good news of the gospel, which does culminate in the cross of Jesus Christ, where we bring our hurts and find forgiveness and find transformation, and because of the resurrection, new life. That's the answer. But we need to learn how to be heard. Folks, my time is gone. Sorry I couldn't say more than that, but I hope some of what